Welcome to Running Strong. I would say welcome back. However, this is the first episode in this deviation or new venture in the podcast space for me. So, thank you for those of you who have continued over from the trail and ultra running training podcast into this new offshoot. And for those of you who are new to me, I appreciate you joining me. I hope you find these things useful. The whole goal of this podcast is to help people train a little better and whatever that may mean, right? Like, we're all pursuing different goals. We might be looking to PR a race. We might be looking to do some kind of big adventure in the mountains. Some of us might just really enjoy the training and just want to do a little better week after week. Or we might want some combination of all of those things, which is what I'm looking for this year. So whatever you're looking for, whatever you're trying to get out of running and training and strength work, I hope that you find these things helpful. And if you do, I'd appreciate you hitting subscribe or sharing it with someone. And for those of you who are kind of following me over from the last platform, if you hear that this episode's out and you see it and you don't see it on your normal podcast player under the new name, or hell, even under the old name, I don't know how these things work. Please let me know, probably sooner rather than later. It already feels like I'm kind of shouting into the void, being alone in my apartment speaking into a microphone. So if I'm actually shouting into the void and nobody can access this, that feels silly to me. So if you listen to this on whatever player and it's not there or it's not updated, let me know and I will see what buttons I need to click, because I think I clicked them all, but I'm often wrong because I'm just not great at tech. So I'd appreciate the feedback if it's there. Anyway, housekeeping out of the way. Today, I want to talk a little bit about data and what makes good data, and specifically a lactate threshold heart rate test. And we get a little more caffeine in my system, and we'll really get going into that. So, last Sunday, I did a lactate threshold heart rate test, specifically the 30-minute version, and it was unpleasant, as it's supposed to be, right? And you might ask why, especially as someone who has gone repeatedly on record as saying that I think most of us should probably train at least largely by effort, right? Use data as a backstop, and that's still how I feel. But if we're using data as a backstop and that data isn't accurate, or we're looking at the wrong numbers, then we can train by effort and then use data as a backstop, and we're getting the wrong feedback. And this is kind of my experience here. I have had a long relationship undulating through many cycles of how much data I collect and what I feel is important, and it has gone way up and down, and right now it is pretty low. I don't collect a lot. I don't check my HRV score in the morning, partially because it's always bad, and some of that is probably genetic because those numbers really aren't, they're only relevant to you, and a lot of the devices don't see that, partially because I don't sleep enough, and partially because the device I use to check that, I can't wear a watch when I sleep. It drives me crazy. So the ring I used to use didn't fit perfectly. I'm like a half size. So if it spun at all in the night, it just told me it was terrible, which it always spins in the night. So, I don't track a lot of these things. And part of that is because it drives me crazy. It's very easy for me to get somewhat obsessive over these metrics that probably don't really matter. So a while ago, I was going to say a couple months, but it's actually probably been over a year now, I just ditched a lot of that stuff. I gave some of it away. I offloaded some things. I just don't track a lot. And as a consequence, I've probably had the best year of training I've ever had, and I'm stronger and faster than I've ever been. And all of that has come from working by effort and actually listening to my body and trying to pay attention to what I am really looking to achieve, and only really focusing on the performance metrics that I want to get, right? If I want to run an X mile, then that speed matters and the recovery matters, and being able to go into those workouts that help that improve matter, but it doesn't really matter what a algorithm says is my recovery. I either am able to do the work or I'm not, and then I need to do it or not, right? And this is kind of where I've come to with a lot of data. However, I do really appreciate all of the data to which we have access these days, right? Like, I coach people all over the world, and I also coach people in person. And being an in-person coach is really rewarding, and it's faster. I can make adjustments in time. Like, we can look at something and be like, hey, change that now. And it's just the timeline becomes shorter when you're working with someone in person. But a lot of us don't need that level of correction or accountability or whatever. And working online allows those of us who don't need or want that level of precision to still get some help and also still have some freedom, right? Like, you don't need to meet a person to do the thing every week. You can just do the thing at your leisure, and then we can talk about it afterwards, or maybe make adjustments if possible in the moment as much as we can, or morning of. And it just gives a little more freedom to both me and the people with whom I work. It also allows me to have a wider breadth, right? Like, I work with someone in Australia, and I don't live in Australia as much as I might like to, because it's lovely. But it does allow me to work with just a wider group of people than it would if I were only working in person, right? And I can't do that without some level of data. I'd be really ineffective if I just said, hey, go at it, and then wasn't able to make adjustments. So, like, looking at these things that watches or numbers or whatever provide is helpful. Being able to tell someone or ask someone to please record a video for a lift that they're struggling with and have them be able to do that immediately, because we all have cameras on us at all times, again, for better or worse, is helpful to me in my job. But it also can lead to struggles where I talked about, where we can get like obsessive, etc., right? So it's nice to be able to have that wider reach. Also, data can help us see changes over time, right? Like, a lot of these things happen at what can feel like a really like tedious or glacial or slow pace. And if you're the one doing it day after day, you might not really even notice the improvements. But when someone comes to me and like they're frustrated with their pace because they got dropped on their group run on the weekend, we can look back and look a year ago how they're actually running like 2 minutes a mile faster, and their heart rate's lower. So they're even working less hard and moving faster than they were a year ago. But their experience doesn't match that because it's been a slow progress over the course of a year. And their friends have also gotten faster. And all of their friends have been running a lot longer to them. So they're still getting dusted out on the trail. But it doesn't mean that they aren't making progress. It just means that the frustration's there, right? So some of this perspective is also really achievable by data that you just wouldn't have experientially, especially if you're working in a group or some of these like settings where it can be really tough to assess your progress. So I do appreciate data, but I just think it needs to be good, and it actually needs to be useful, right? Like, if we're using data as a guide, then it should probably actually apply. It should apply to us, right? If I want to use numbers to guide my training, then those numbers should be relative to me, not someone who's a lot better than me as a runner because they've been doing it longer or they just have a higher level of talent. It shouldn't be relevant to whoever. It should be relevant to me, right? And this is why we need to probably like set some targets if we're going to actually use it. And if we aren't going to set those targets, then we can ditch most of it, which again is why I ditched a lot of it a year ago, because I didn't really feel like I was in a place to set good targets. And I just wanted to see how a lot of this felt. However, over the past, couple months, I've been noticing some things. I've gotten a lot of questions about heart rate from people who I coach. And I have gotten a lot of questions about effort. Like, it can be really difficult, especially if you're working on varied terrain, to know what certain things feel like, especially if you don't have a like beginning thing to go off of, right? Like if you've never run a hard 10K, if you've never raced that, then you don't know what that pace might be. You don't know how it absolutely feels terrible from a third of the way through the race, and yet you just kind of hold on for the rest of it. You might not know any of these sensations, so running by effort might be almost farcical, right? Like, and it can be difficult to set these efforts when you don't have that background. And I absolutely have that experience as well, right? Like I'm not, it's not like I've been running for that long. I remember getting into this, and it was during my very obsessive data time. So looked up all this stuff and saw these recommendations, and it was difficult to parse like recommendations built on elite professional athletes who run a half marathon in an hour, right? So when you see a program written by, written for, or done by a professional runner, their half marathon pace or effort level is probably closer to my 10K pace or effort level. And so a lot of these judgments can be difficult to determine. Same with heart rate, right? Like heart rate is very personal and it is somewhat genetically dictated. So figuring out zones from a general recommendation online can be challenging. I also struggle sometimes with like getting obsessed over like weird jumps in their data. A good example is like a cadence lock. Like if you use a heart rate monitor on your watch, then sometimes your watch can just get locked to your cadence rather than your heart rate. So it looks like your heart rate spiked really high for however long in the run when you were having a really good conversation, maybe even singing a song, and we know that's not matched, and it's not good to listen to that data because it's just not helpful, right? So figuring out what data is useful and what can actually be applicable and what things like we might want to use to guide our training is challenging. And sometimes you just need to get rid of all of it and then reintegrate in ways that feel useful. So if we don't know how things feel, then we might want to get some metrics to figure that out. Now, first, before I go on with this heart rate test thing, I will say if you're new to running, if you're new to any sport or training or athleticism, whatever, just do it a bit first. Like trying to perfect your training from the outset is only going to lead to frustration, and it's actually not going to be that useful. If you're only running 10 miles a week, then do what you need to do to get that volume up a little more. If you're only running like 2 30-minute sessions a week, we don't need to obsess with whether you're in zone 2. Don't need to obsess with lactate things. Don't need to obsess about anything other than maybe focusing on your form a little bit to make sure that we're running well, running safely, running in a way that allows us to get better over time. And we need to focus on getting our volume up and recovering. Once we're at some sort of threshold, and it's different for different people, right? It's different for reasons of whether it fits into your life and how much you need, and different people adapt to different levels of training. But once we're up to a few hours a week, then we can start to focus on these things. But if you're super new and your volume's really low, then it's not going to be all that helpful to figure out perfect heart rate zones, because one, those don't exist, and two, it's just not the priority right now. I say the same thing to people with lifting, right? Like the first couple weeks, you're just going to be figuring out new movement patterns. First couple months, realistically, but especially the first couple weeks. I tend to do programming in like 6-week phases, give or take. I used to do a lot shorter, but it's really come to attention that like the first couple weeks, we're getting used to the movements, and you might see large jumps in weight on the bar or picking up bigger dumbbells. And some of that just comes down to the fact that you're getting better at the movement. Yes, you're getting stronger, and some of strength is you figuring out how to use your body well and do the movement better. But it's not like we put on a ton of muscle mass in 2 weeks that allowed you to double your squat. You just got better at squatting. And this is one of these things that can be a big challenge for people, right? So if we're cycling programs every 2 to 3 weeks when it comes to strength, or changing out our exercises every week, then we don't give ourselves enough time to actually get good at them so that we can use those exercises to make the progress that we want to make. So if you're new to any of this, then at the beginning, focus on form, doing it in a way that's helpful, and getting up enough volume that we can make this useful. Once we're there, then we might want to actually set some targets. And if we're going to set those targets, we should probably set targets that are actually applicable to us, right? Because otherwise, we're just trying to get this false precision. So this is why I did a 30-minute heart rate test a little less than a week ago. Because I got a heart rate monitor a little bit a couple months ago, and I've been using it fairly consistently. I've struggled with heart rate monitors in the past because I hate the chest strap. I just hate how it feels. I know it's accurate, but I don't use it very well because I don't want to. And this is the other thing when it comes to collecting data. You should probably use things that, unless you're really trying to hit these peak levels of performance, right? If I were trying to be highly competitive in Boston Marathon, then one, I'd probably be actually taking lactate blood levels. But if I were trying to use heart rate for that, I would use a chest strap because it is more accurate. But for me and my purposes, the little Koros armband thing is great. I'll actually use it. I don't hate it. I barely notice it's there. I don't feel like I'm being slowly squeezed by a really weak person. So using the armband has been really sticky for me. It is a thing that has been really helpful. So that's one. Use systems or use devices that you'll actually want to use. That is going to be a big point when trying to figure out how you want to collect data. So I got this a couple months ago, and I've been using it fairly consistently. And I've noticed some stuff about my effort levels and things that are heart rates not necessarily correlating with what I would expect to find. So, and they were all higher, right? Been running at these effort levels, and I was trying to figure out if I was just lying to myself. But I really didn't feel like I was. It felt like I was running in zone 2, but based on a bunch of estimates, I'd be well above that zone. So I started questioning all of these numbers, and it just started to eat at me. And I decided to finally do a test that is pretty well validated and see where whether I was lying to myself or whether I was more on the anomalous side of heart rate stuff, right? And to give you some numbers, I'm 35, and I haven't seen much above the high 180s in a while in my heart rate. So it seemed like I was kind of falling into that bell curve. Well, to be fair, I haven't done longer length VO2 max style, high speed workouts in a while. I've been doing more short repeats to build up speed, which don't necessarily elevate your heart rate as much. So I've had no real need or real reason to expect that my max heart rate was the highest heart rate I've seen over the past couple months. But again, things get at you after you see them a while. And if my max heart rate were in the low 180s, mid 180s, then that probably means that my easy zone should be right about 150, maybe even lower. And that's just not what I was experiencing. So I started to collect some data. I didn't change anything. I didn't panic. I didn't start pushing records down. I just wanted to see what I'd find. And over the past couple months, the numbers just seemed higher than my experience would dictate. So I finally decided to do a test, and I did this 30-minute lactate threshold heart rate test. And I think it was created by the old triathlete coach, Joe Friel. If it wasn't, he certainly popularized it. And here's how you do it. You go run, you warm up 10, 15 minutes, really whatever you need to get moving. Some people are going to take longer than others. You might be feeling really good after about 5 to 10. You might need 10 to 20. But get moving. Maybe toss in a couple surges to promote a little more leg speed and get rolling. Once we're feeling good, you're going to run as hard as you can for 30 minutes. Like at the end of 30 minutes, you should feel toasted. You should be ready to be done. It should be a struggle to keep continue running at the pace at which you're running. And you're really trying to view this as like a 30-minute race. And some other things, you really need to do it alone because you're trying to figure out your effort. You can't have someone else dictate it for you. And it can't be on a treadmill because, again, you're not trying to lock yourself into a pace. You're trying to push it. It should also probably be on somewhat flat terrain if you plan to use the pace data for any sort of metric. Because while you might be able to crank your heart rate hard running up a hill, as soon as you come down the hill, we're going to see a mismatch between your muscles' ability to control your descent and your ability to push hard enough to elevate your heart rate. So that'll throw it off for one. And two, if you're climbing a 10-degree hill, then sure, and for the whole thing, we might get some good heart rate data that will set you in a zone, but it doesn't really give you any applicable pace data. So if all you do is run uphill, great, that might be perfect for you. But for most of us, we're going to spend a lot of our time training on more flat terrain because that's what we have access to outside our house. And then even if we do spend a lot of time on trails, then we can apply some of that flat data that we'd use more often to the trail data, right? So run hard for 30 minutes. Just try to kill it. Once you're done, the final 20 minutes of that 30-minute block is what's going to matter for data purposes, right? So when I set this up for athletes and plug it into Training Peaks that go into their watch, I set a 15-minute warm-up with the ability for them to end that step with the lap button. So if they're ready to move forward sooner, great, they can click lap and get going. And if they need a little more time, then great, they just let that extend and then they'll click the lap button and keep going or get going on with the next piece. Then I have 2 blocks back to back, one 10-minute and one 20-minute. And I would actually prefer if they don't even notice or care. I know the watch is going to buzz at them. It doesn't matter, right? It just allows the data to be a little more separable when I look at it after the fact. Because the final 20 minutes is what we care about. Because for the final 20 minutes of that, your average heart rate and average pace should be pretty close to your lactate threshold heart rate and pace relevant to grade. Now, it's a lot to say. One note, it's really hard, and it should absolutely count as one of your workouts for the week. You should go into this fueled, you should go into this hydrated. You should expect that you're going to need some recovery fuel and hydration around this. You should probably expect that you'll need some sleep, right? This is a hard workout. Treat it as such. If not, then you're probably going to end up crashing and struggling a little bit. And what did I learn? I learned that my lactate threshold heart rate is apparently around 185. I feel like that's a little high. It seems a little higher than what I was experiencing, but low 180s is about right for what I have noticed. Now, this is where I need to make the caveat that heart rate does change a little bit on the day. It can adjust up or down by a few points based on whether you're tired or you slept less or you had more caffeine or whatever, right? So it's possible that I just wasn't as well slept and drank too much caffeine that day. I don't think it was more than normal, but it's possible. So maybe that's a little high, but it does feel like it's in the right ballpark. And that should be my maximum heart rate if we're going to take a lot of these bell curves published by people like Phil Maffetone, right? So if I'd actually been training by the numbers provided to me by those estimates, the numbers that my watch has been screaming at me about for months, the numbers that most people would expect, I would have spent almost all of my time in zone 1. I would never have truly pushed myself to get better. I would never have push these like uphill lactate workouts that I've been doing on the treadmill. And in fact, it's very possible that quite a few of those lactate workouts were a little easier than they even should be, because I was somewhere in the low 170s for a lot of them and probably needed to be closer up to 180. So it does seem that I'm outside the normal bell curve of heart rate. And this is true for quite a few people, right? Now, the point of this email, sorry, it was originally an email. The point of this podcast is not like, fuck it, do whatever you want, right? Point is, if you're going to use data, it should be helpful, right? Like, we're trying to set zones, we're trying to set things that will actually be useful to you in moving forward and guiding your training. So if you feel like something's wrong, if you can't figure out what these zones feel like, then we need to maybe do a test like this, because something like max heart rate or even heart rate reserve is probably not going to get you there. If you're going to set zones, if you're going to work off of zones, then those zones should be right. And one of the best ways to do it is this 30-minute test. And it is unpleasant and it is hard, but otherwise we're just kind of working on false numbers. We certainly shouldn't be going off the zones that are randomly calculated by your watch. I've found those to be very inaccurate for most people. So we should run these tests and figure out how they are. Otherwise, we might just be missing a lot of benefits, right? Like, I can't imagine the lack of progress I would have made over the past year if I had been running all of my easy runs at like a 145. I just wouldn't have gotten there, right? Like, I can't imagine the lack of progress I would have made if I had not allowed my heart rate to go above like 160 something or whatever the natural setting is on my watch for all this lactate work. I just wouldn't have gotten there. So if we're going to so on the plus side, I did just kind of go by feel. I know what these efforts feel like, and I went with it. But if you don't, or if you want to verify the things that you might expect, let's run these. And you might learn that you're just pushing too hard. That is a very common thing to find as well. I am not necessarily the poster person for what you might discover on a run like this. A lot of people do something like this and realize they've actually been cranking it way too hard and spending their zone 2 work all in their threshold space, which is also really important. We don't want that. It's harder to recover from. It's really difficult. You're not getting the aerobic benefits you're trying to get, right? Like, different zones and different like relative training intensities have a prioritization towards different benefits, right? Like, everything's a spectrum. It's not like running a VO2 workout gets you zero aerobic benefits, but we can prioritize them a little better with a little less risk for overtraining. And that's often the thing you might find. But you also might find that you're an anomaly and that a lot of the expectations you have are more, or a lot of the feelings you have are backed by some of this data, right? So when it comes to setting heart rate zones, figure out what your lactate threshold is. It's a pretty simple test. I was going to say easy. It's not easy. It's difficult. You got to go work really hard. I wanted to not do it anymore after about like 15 minutes into it. That's only about halfway through. And then you just got to keep pushing. It is like a race. You have to want to get the outcome. You have to want to get the result. You have to give a shit about it. If you don't, then don't like waste your time half-assing it. Go into it ready. If it's not the day to do it, then push it back to later in the week. Right? Like, this doesn't need to happen on Tuesday just because that's when you programmed it. If you wake up and you feel like shit on Tuesday, then push it to Thursday. Like, take an easy day, take recovery, get a little more food, and then do it later. But if you're going to use zones from a training perspective, then this is probably a test we should care about, because it's going to give us a really good indication of what we're actually trying to achieve. Because heart rate is really dictated by genetics, right? Like, I've known people with a max heart rate who were in their 50s, close to 200, and I've known people in their 20s with a max heart rate in the 130s. And both of those people that are like very fresh in my mind were really good athletes. They just have a different genetic profile. And I don't know what that means from a health perspective. I don't think any of us do. But from a performance perspective, it doesn't matter, right? Like, it doesn't matter what your max heart rate is. It doesn't matter what your threshold is. It matters that we're training appropriately in relation to those things. So the only way to know is to test it. And you can either go through the struggle of like getting your finger or earlobe pricked a lot and doing blood levels and like figuring out a curve by a qualified person, or you can just go run really fucking hard for 30 minutes and figure out what that feels like and figure out what your heart rate might be when it feels like that. And once you get that data, then you can use that for a really long time. You may retest this, but Joe Friel, the creator or popularizer, I think he's the creator. We're just going to call him the creator. The creator of this test used to do this quite a bit with athletes, and he said he saw almost no change in the actual number. Saw a lot of changes in the pace and the effort and all the stuff that went around the number, well, the pace and the speed, etc., that went around the number, but the actual number stayed pretty static. So once you get this, you don't have to do it very often. You might do it every couple of years just to see based on time-related changes to your heart rate, but it's not a thing you need to do quarterly. You just have to do this once. And if you have really good data from something like a 10K where you did go race really hard in this like 40 to 60, 70 minute window, then you can just use that. If you are a person who runs a lot of races and you do try to perform well at those races, if you're in that 10K spot, or if you're a professional, no professionals listen to this, but if you're a professional, maybe a half marathon spot, then that can be your indicator. But if we're not, like, if we don't race a lot, then this is a really easy test for you to do, to just grab that and figure out where you're going to set. So I hope this was helpful. It was a good, like, rambling thoughts on data. If you do this test and you want me to look at any of it, you have the data, I'm happy to do that. It's not a thing that would take me very long, so you're welcome to like reach out, shoot me a DM, shoot me a message, and we can give it a shot. You also don't need to do any of this. You can just run by effort if you have a really good tune with what this feels like, right? Like, I'm a huge proponent of running by effort if you have a good connection with your effort. But if you aren't sure what that is, or if you really feel like something's off, then this could be a useful thing to do. I hope this was a helpful, like, first episode in this new podcast direction. And if you have any questions or whatever, shoot me a message. And please subscribe. Tell other people to subscribe. Send this to them. And I hope to be doing this for a while longer. Have a great day.